Four-way emergency talks have wrapped up in Geneva, Switzerland, aimed at resolving the deepening crisis in eastern Ukraine. Top diplomats from Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the European Union spent about 7 hours wrestling through a compromise to the situation which has been called the worst East-West crisis since the end of the Cold War. Meanwhile, violence worsened in the days before the talks. In the southeastern city of Mariupol, 3 pro-Russian militants died and 13 were wounded when Ukrainian troops repelled an attack on a National Guard base in the Black Sea port. That's according to Ukraine's Interior Ministry. In Donetsk, the self-declared chairman of the People's Council said he wants a referendum by May 11th to ask residents if they wanted sovereignty. And in Slavyansk, pro-Russian militants are firmly in control. The U.S. has promised to send non-lethal military aid to Ukraine, which includes medical supplies, helmets, water purification units, and power generators. Earlier, I spoke with RT's Egor Piskunov from Geneva and asked him to take us through what happened at the meeting.
Well, this meeting lasted for over 7 hours, which is frankly much longer than initially expected, but perhaps that just shows how significant and complicated the situation in Ukraine really is. But in the end, the participants of the meeting here in Geneva were able to draw up a roadmap aimed at easing the tensions there in Ukraine. And, well, it includes the demands for all the illegal armed groups in Ukraine to put their weapons down and vacate or free the buildings that they've captured. They also have to refrain from any further violence or provocations. Also, an amnesty must be granted to all the protesters except for those who are found guilty of capital crimes. And the current authorities in Kiev must provide an effective and transparent constitutional reform which would uphold the rights of all the regions in the country, both in the west, especially in the east and southeast of the country, which is currently one of the most turbulent regions of Ukraine. It does look good on paper, but the question is how effective would this roadmap be in real life, since there are many sticking points. For instance, many of these armed groups are simply out of control. Just look at the right sector, for instance, one of the most radical nationalist organizations there in Ukraine, which basically was one of the main forces behind the recent uprising and one of the main forces which actually drove the current authorities in Kiev to power. It's a question of how much control do these authorities have over them right now. Also, when it comes to refraining from further violence and provocations, well, the gap between the southeast of Ukraine and Kiev is so wide right now, and the tensions are so high they could even be called hatred between these armed groups. It's so strong. It's a question of would this amnesty, even if it was introduced, would that be enough to force them to stop the violence, put their weapons down, and so on. And finally, there's a big question is how effective would this constitutional reform be, knowing that the current authorities in Kiev were very skeptical of this meeting here in Geneva altogether. So in other words, would they actually follow this roadmap, even though it's also planned that the whole situation there and how this would be put in real life, this roadmap, it's supposed to be controlled by the international community, or including by the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Its representatives are there in Ukraine right now. But like I said, there are so many sticking points that even if this roadmap does look well on paper, it's a question of how effective would it be in real life.
Well, as the OSCE is on the ground there and is going to start taking steps to tamp down the violence that we've seen, what about the economic sanctions we've seen batted around and threatened regarding the situation?
Well, this is another aspect of this whole story which perhaps isn't so much linked to the situation there in Ukraine itself, but is more about political games between the West and Russia. Since we've heard from U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry here in Geneva following these talks, blaming Russia for much of what's happening in the southeast of Ukraine. I'm talking about these pro-Russian armed groups, of course, but it is a big question of how relevant that is to the actual, of how relevant blaming Russia is to the actual situation there in Ukraine. And it's also a question of what I was talking about, the control, how much control, or whether any control, does Moscow have any control over these armed groups, pro-Russian even armed groups in that part of the country. Also, Washington is talking about the whole issue of sanctions, how much that is relevant to the situation in Ukraine itself, since they're talking about either more sanctions and more pressure on Moscow if the situation continues to deteriorate, or they might lift some of the sanctions if it becomes better. But perhaps, and what many analysts have been saying, they should really be focused, and they do have a lot of influence on the new authorities in Kiev right now, and perhaps they should be more focused on stopping the violence, stopping the bloodshed, and then thinking about sanctioning Moscow.
All right, RT's Egor Piskunov in Geneva. Thank you very much.